Hey friends, it's Jimmy here with that usual quick reminder to hit the like and subscribe buttons before we start. Also, don't forget to drop a quick comment saying where you're listening from or what you're doing. The renowned Apache warrior Geronimo spent his life fighting American and Mexican forces intent on capturing him and his people. In 1886, he surrendered for the final time and, deemed too dangerous to ever be released, spent the rest of his life in captivity. But the conflict that surrounded him in life didn't end with his death. Instead, it morphed into a macabre, century-long controversy. His remains are now allegedly in the possession of a powerful, ultra-secretive organization representing the final symbolic capture of a legendary figure by shadowy forces. Geronimo died of pneumonia in February 1909 and was buried at the Apache Indian Prisoner of War Cemetery on the base. His general gravesite today is marked by a distinctive pyramid of stones topped with an eagle. However, these stones don't mark the exact spot he was buried. Rather, this collection of stones marks the generalized area where he was initially buried in an unmarked grave. His burial on active military land meant his remains were under the direct jurisdiction of the institution that had held him captive. A decade after Geronimo's burial, the cemetery at Fort Sill became the site of an alleged grave robbery. Around 1917, a group of soldiers who were also members of the elite Yale University secret society, known as Skull and Bones, was stationed at the fort during World War I. Interestingly, among the men who were there was Prescott Bush, a future United States Senator and the father and grandfather of two American presidents. Known for stealing significant quote-unquote keepsakes, this group allegedly exhumed Geronimo's grave. The primary evidence is a letter written in 1918 by Bonesman Winter Mead. This correspondence casually boasted that the skull of Geronimo, along with both of his femurs, had been looted by other bonesmen. He claimed in this letter that they had been removed from Fort Sill, and they were now inside the Society's New Haven headquarters, known as the Tomb. It's important to note that he didn't claim to be directly involved in this or have directly seen any evidence of this. However, the skull's authenticity, if such a skull is even in their possession, is intensely disputed. Historians suggest the gravesite was still unmarked at the time, potentially leading the college-aged hooligans to rob another grave entirely. Some have also questioned whether Meade was ever at Fort Sill and whether the letter was supposed to be read literally or not. There's also been allegations that the letter was effectively an internal hoax, perhaps as a way to quote-unquote prank new initiates to the secret society. Furthermore, some direct descendants on the Mescalero Apache Reservation believe that local Apaches relocated Geronimo's body soon after his death. This possibility greatly complicates any certainty about the identity of the remains held in the tomb, if these remains are even there. Notably, Skull and Bones has maintained a wall of silence, as one may expect from a secret society. Yale, for its part, has consistently denied involvement, stating it holds no relics or bones belonging to Geronimo, and claiming the secret society operates independently. In 2009, faced with the enduring controversy, Geronimo's lineal descendants filed a federal lawsuit against the federal government, Yale, and Skull and Bones. They aimed to compel the return of the alleged skull under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990. The federal court ultimately dismissed the claims against all the defendants on technical legal grounds. The decision hinged on two legal barriers. First, the court ruled the act was inapplicable. The law establishes ownership priority only for items excavated or discovered after its enactment in November 1990. Since the alleged theft occurred well before this, the claim fell outside the statute's temporal scope. Second, the plaintiffs failed to overcome the doctrine of sovereign immunity with respect to the feds only. This principle shields the government from lawsuits unless that right is explicitly waived. At present, the true location of Geronimo's skull and his other remains continues to be an unsolved historical mystery. He may still be interred at Fort Sill in an unmarked grave, or he may have been secretly repatriated. However, if the allegations are true, his skull and some of his other earthly remains may still remain locked up in a sinister vault in New England. Hey everyone, just a quick reminder to click the share button and send this video around to your friends and family. Now with that said, we've still got a lot more content to cover, so let's get down to business. On a cold winter night in 1799, 22-year-old Elma Sands left her Manhattan boarding house with a secret. She planned to elope with Levy Weeks. She never returned. 11 days later, her lifeless body was pulled from the bottom of a well in Lower Manhattan, shocking the city and setting the stage for one of America's first sensational trials. The investigation and trial that followed would captivate the public, pit powerful lawyers against each other, and leave a mystery that still haunts New York history. Elma Sands lived in a Greenwich Street boarding house run by her cousins, Catherine and Elias Ring. On December 22, 1799, she confided that she and Levy Weeks, a fellow boarder who had been courting her, were going to marry in secret that night. Around 8 that night, she left home, presumably with Levy. By 10, Weeks had returned alone, expressing surprise that Elma was still out and denying that they had been together earlier. When Elma didn't come home, alarms spread quickly. New York was blanketed in snow that evening, and some witnesses claimed they saw Elma riding in a one-horse sleigh with 2 men. One reportedly resembled Weeks, and the horse matched one owned by Levy's brother Ezra. Suspicion fell on Weeks as the last person seen with her, but nothing came of it just yet. A few days later, boys discovered a woman's hat floating in the water of a well in Manhattan, in what's now the Soho area. It was recognized as Elma's, pointing investigators to the well. On January 2nd, 1800, searchers pulled Elma's body from the bottom of that well. Her corpse showed clear signs of foul play, and authorities started to investigate, with Weeks swiftly deemed the prime suspect. Even before Weeks was brought to trial, the city was outraged over Elma's fate. The Ring family immediately accused Levy in public, sharing details of her disappearance with the press. New York newspapers ran with the story, and soon the case was the talk of the town. In the court of public opinion, Weeks was considered guilty before he was even arrested. In a macabre twist, Elma's body was put on public display at the boarding house for several days before burial. So many people came to view the victim's body that the coffin had to be moved outside to accommodate the onlookers. This grim exhibition further stirred emotions. Seeing Elma's pale form made the tragedy real and intensified calls for justice. By the time Weeks was indicted, angry crowds were clamoring for his swift execution. Levy Weeks was a young carpenter who worked for his wealthy brother Ezra Weeks, one of New York's most prominent builders. Desperate to save Levy from a likely hanging, Ezra pulled in favors and used his connections to secure an extraordinary defense team. Notably, Ezra's company had built Alexander Hamilton's mansion, so to say he had some clout would be an understatement. Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, usually bitter political rivals, agreed to join forces to defend Weeks. They enlisted a third attorney, Henry Brockholst Livingston, an experienced trial lawyer, and future Supreme Court justice. This dream team of counsel was unprecedented and turned the trial into a major public spectacle. The trial of Levy Weeks began on March 31, 1800 in New York City Hall before Chief Justice John Lansing, Jr. The case became so widely followed that crowds of onlookers from all levels of society packed the courtroom. The prosecution's case, led by Cadwallader Colden, was entirely circumstantial, with no eyewitnesses. Prosecutors argued that Weeks had seduced Elma with false promises of marriage and then eliminated her to escape the scandal, perhaps fearing she was carrying his child. Boarders from the Ring House testified about Levy and Elma's relationship and the events of the night she vanished. One witness claimed to see him lurking around the well at night shortly before the crime. Another witness, a fellow boarder, claimed that Levy was the type to get into intimate situations with young ladies and leave them high and dry. He claimed that Levy promised them marriage, but insisted he couldn't do this without banging harder than a carriage wheel hitting cobblestone. Hamilton, Burr, and Livingston vigorously countered these claims. The defense cast doubt on every aspect of the story. They argued there may not even have been a killing at all. To support this theory, they brought in medical witnesses who now asserted that Elma might have jumped into the well herself out of despair. Acquaintances described Elma as emotionally troubled before her death, even recalling that she had questioned the purpose of life. Further, they insinuated that she may have been having affairs with married men, including her cousin's husband. The trial was unusually long for its time, running into the early morning hours of the second day. As proceedings dragged past midnight, jurors struggled to stay awake. Justice Lansing refused to pause for rest and even denied the prosecutor a closing argument, signaling that he found the evidence against Weeks weak. In his charge to the jury, Lansing bluntly stated that the proof was insufficient to convict. It took the jury only about 5 minutes to deliberate before returning a verdict of not guilty. Levy Weeks was acquitted, ending the trial in astonishing fashion. The verdict did not calm the public's fury. Many New Yorkers were outraged that Weeks walked free, believing that a rich man's influence had helped him escape punishment. Judge Lansing's conduct was widely criticized as a betrayal of justice. In the aftermath, Weeks was shunned and harassed. Unable to live in New York amid the hostility, he left the city and eventually settled in Natchez, Mississippi, where he quietly rebuilt his life as an architect until his death in 1819. No one else was ever charged for Elma's death, which meant the case remained officially unsolved. Some key figures in the trial later met tragic ends. In 1804, Burr and Hamilton's simmering rivalry exploded in their famous duel. Years later, in 1829, Judge Lansing vanished without a trace, leading some to whisper about a curse tied to Elma Sands. While it looks to me that there wasn't sufficient evidence to find Levy Weeks guilty, there's no denying that the proceedings carried a troubling stench of influence and favoritism. The entire case rested on circumstantial fragments, yet the speed with which the judge dismissed the prosecution's arguments felt unusual even by early American standards. Lansing's refusal to allow a full closing argument and his insistence on pushing the jury through exhaustion are odd choices. However, his pointed remarks about the weakness of the evidence creates the impression that the outcome had been shaped long before the verdict was delivered. Add to that the towering presence of Hamilton and Burr, both political powerhouses with deep ties to Ezra Weeks, and the appearance of a slanted playing field becomes hard to ignore. Levy may have walked free because the evidence wasn't strong enough, but the way the trial unfolded left many convinced justice had been openly bent. You're traveling alone on a dark, winding road, with only the rhythmic clopping of your horse's hooves for company. Suddenly, you hear another set of hoofbeats behind you, gaining fast. You urge your horse onward, but the sound grows louder, closer, an unnatural thunder in the quiet night. You risk a glance over your shoulder and see a towering figure on a powerful steed, matching your pace with terrifying ease. He's cloaked in shadow, but as he draws alongside you, you see the truth. a sight that freezes the blood in your veins. Where the rider's head should be, there is only an empty, ragged collar. This chilling figure, the Headless Horseman, is more than just the villain of a single ghost story. He's an ancient archetype, a phantom who has galloped through the folklore of cultures across the world for over a millennium. Long before a galloping Hessian terrorized New York's Hudson Valley, his spectral ancestors haunted the roads and moors of Europe. The archetype is not a monolith, and each culture has shaped its horseman to reflect its deepest fears. Perhaps the most sinister of these is Ireland's Dullahan. His name means dark man in Gaelic, and he's a dark fairy from the underworld. The Dullahan rides a headless black horse and carries his own decaying head under his arm, its eyes darting about with supernatural sight to seek out its next victim. In some tales, he wields a whip made from a human spine and drives a coach constructed from bones and skin. Folklore suggests he may be the lingering spirit of the ancient Celtic god Crom Dubh, who demanded sacrifices by decapitation before the arrival of Christianity. In contrast, German folklore presents a more morally complex figure, often tied to the broader myth of the wild hunt. Germany's headless riders are frequently revenants, the ghosts of wicked men who are condemned to wander the earth until they atone for their crimes. But unlike their Celtic equivalent, these spirits aren't always malevolent, with many of them being forced to do good deeds as a form of penance. In some versions of this legend, only when they've repaid their debt to society can they be made whole again and rest peacefully. Some versions of Der Kopfloser Reiter, as they're known in German, act as supernatural guardians, sounding a hunting horn to warn travelers of impending danger. Other times they appear and scare hunters, preventing them venturing out when they believe they'll meet tragedy that day. Still other times they are sent to hound down outlaws, serving as enforcers of a moral order they defied in their own lives. The Headless Horseman rode into the American consciousness and into global fame in 1820 with Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Irving, a master storyteller, didn't invent the figure but brilliantly adapted it, creating a uniquely American ghost. While living in England, he absorbed European folklore, drawing heavily from German tales of ghostly hunters he likely learned about through his friendship with Sir Walter Scott. Irving's genius was to take this old world phantom and anchor it in the soil and history of the New World. He set his story in the Hudson Valley, a region he knew intimately, and populated it with characters bearing the names of real local Dutch families. This led to his fiction having a chilling air of authenticity. Most importantly, Irving gave his horsemen a specific historical identity: the ghost of a Hessian trooper decapitated by a cannonball during the American Revolutionary War. The Hessians were German mercenaries hired by the British, and they were widely feared by the American colonists, making them a perfect choice for a ghost that resonated nationally. Notably, the Headless Horseman himself appears to be based in real, authentic history, as evidenced by something that happened during the Battle of White Plains in October 1776. This location, which is less than 10 miles from the real Sleepy Hollow, featured a Hessian horseman who took a cannonball straight to the dome. And spoiler alert, in case you haven't read about this battle yet, the horseman didn't make it. Irving transformed this brutal footnote into the origin story for America's greatest ghost. What makes Irving's story so enduring, however, is its profound ambiguity. He never confirms if the horseman is a genuine specter or simply Ichabod Crane's rival, the brawny Brom Bones, in a clever disguise. The discovery of a shattered pumpkin near Ichabod's abandoned hat strongly suggests a prank, though this is ultimately left fairly ambiguous. Beyond any single story, The headless rider haunts us because he taps into a primal and universal set of fears. At its most basic level, the horror is biological. Decapitation is an absolute, unhealable wound that severs the mind, the seat of identity, reason, and consciousness, from the body. A body that can still act, ride, and hunt without a head is a profound violation of the natural order. It represents the terrifying triumph of chaotic, mindless impulse over rational control. This perhaps taps into our deep-seated fear of losing our own minds and becoming subject to forces we can't comprehend. In this way, I personally find that it has some passing resemblance to the mythology we've built up around zombies. The Headless Horseman is a powerful and adaptable archetype all over the Western world, and scholars still struggle to identify why the archetype is so widespread. He's not one ghost, but a legion, reshaped by each culture to carry the weight of its history and its fears. In a quarry in Oberkassel, Germany, back in 1914, workers stumbled upon something extraordinary. Buried deep in the earth for 14,000 years were the skeletons of a man, a woman, and nestled beside them, a dog. This wasn't just a random assortment of bones. It was a deliberate, double human burial that included an animal. This find, now known as the Bonn Oberkassel dog, represents the earliest undisputed evidence of a domesticated dog, a final chapter in a story that had already been unfolding for millennia. But the most poignant part of this story isn't just the dog's age. It's a secret hidden in its teeth. Paleopathological analysis revealed that as a puppy, this animal had suffered from and, against all odds, survived a severe case of canine distemper. This disease is brutal, often fatal, and would have left the young dog incapacitated for weeks. Its survival would have been nearly impossible without intensive human care. Someone had to bring it food and water, keep it warm, and clean up after it. This act of compassion, offered to a sick animal that provided no immediate practical benefit, powerfully suggests that this was no mere tool or beast of burden. This was a pet. For decades, scientists have been locked in a fierce debate over when and where this revolutionary partnership between humans and dogs began. The timeline itself is a moving target, a puzzle created by the different stories told by bones and by genes. The archaeological record, which relies on physical remains, gives us a conservative estimate. The earliest confirmed dog-like fossils, like the one at Bonn Oberkassel, date to around 15,000 years ago. Yet, the genetic record, which uses the molecular clock to estimate when two lineages diverged, pushes the timeline much deeper into the past. These studies suggest that the ancestors of dogs and wolves split anywhere from 20,000 to 40,000 years ago. One compelling hypothesis points to Siberia around 23,000 years ago, during the brutal peak of the last glacial maximum. The logic is that the harsh climate would have isolated human and wolf populations, forcing them into closer contact and potentially kick-starting the domestication process. The geographic puzzle has been just as contentious. For years, the debate was a scientific tug-of-war between Europe and Asia. Team Europe pointed to the hard evidence. The oldest archaeological finds were consistently unearthed there, from Germany to Belgium to Spain. Team Asia, on the other hand, relied on genetics. Studies of modern dogs consistently found the greatest genetic diversity in East and Central Asia. This usually indicates an origin point where a population has had the longest time to evolve. For a long time, these two lines of evidence seemed irreconcilable. However, scientists released a new study in 2016, which seemed to indicate both sides were at least somewhat right. By analyzing the complete genome of a 4,800-year-old dog from Ireland and comparing it to dozens of other ancient canids, researchers discovered a deep genetic split. The dogs from East Asia and Europe and Western Eurasia were less genetically similar than initially thought. Crucially, this split appeared to have happened after the first dog showed up in the archaeological record in both places. This led to the revolutionary dual domestication hypothesis, that dogs were domesticated not once, but twice, independently, on opposite sides of the Eurasian continent. The theory suggests that the original European dogs were later largely replaced by a wave of Asian dogs that migrated westward alongside humans. This brilliant model resolves the central conflict, explaining why the oldest bones are in Europe, while the greatest modern genetic diversity traces back to Asia. Understanding where and when this happened is only part of the puzzle, and perhaps the deeper mystery is how it happened. The dominant theory for years has been the commensal scavenger hypothesis, a story of self-domestication, often called survival of the friendliest. In this scenario, wolves essentially chose us first. The narrative suggests that some ancient wolves were naturally bolder and less fearful than their peers, allowing them to approach human hunter-gatherer camps. This created a new evolutionary niche where friendliness became a powerful selective advantage. The tamer wolves got more food and were tolerated, while the more aggressive or fearful ones were driven off or just outright eaten themselves. Over countless generations, this relentless selection for a single behavioral trait, what scientists have termed tameability, triggered a cascade of unintended physical and hormonal changes. These wolves went from looking like apex predators to having cute floppy ears, friendly puppy dog eyes that look very human, and wagging their tails. In this view, humans were relatively passive actors, simply providing the environment in which wolves domesticated themselves. However, this elegant theory has faced growing criticism. For one, Paleolithic hunter-gatherers were highly nomadic. It's unlikely they stayed in one place long enough to create the massive permanent garbage dumps needed to sustain a dependent wolf population. Furthermore, wolves are apex predators, not natural scavengers, and their instinct is to maintain a significant flight distance from humans, who are also apex predators. A bold wolf approaching a camp full of human competitors would likely have been viewed as a dangerous threat, not a potential friend. This has led to an alternative theory, one that places human agency and emotion at the center of the story: the orphan puppy hypothesis. Drawing from observations of modern hunter-gatherer groups who often capture and raise wild animals, this theory claims that our ancestors actively brought pups into their communities. A wolf pup raised by humans during its critical socialization window can form an unbreakable bond. By repeatedly selecting the friendliest and most cooperative pups from these litters to raise and breed, humans would have taken a much more direct and intentional role. This model aligns far better with the emotional evidence from the Bonn Oberkassel burial, where a sick puppy was clearly nurtured with great care. Had the hunter-gatherer who had the sick puppy simply viewed the young dog as a tool, it's unlikely that it would have been nurtured to such an extent. However it began, the process of domestication fundamentally remade the wolf. The selection for tameness unleashed a cascade of changes known as domestication syndrome. As proto-dogs evolved, they developed shorter snouts, smaller teeth, reduced body size, and the now familiar floppy ears and wagging tails. These traits are thought to be byproducts of altering the genes that control fear and aggression. Genetic comparisons between modern dogs and wolves reveal major differences in genes related to brain function and neurochemistry. Dogs possess genetic variations linked to hypersocial behavior in a region of the genome that is associated with extreme trust and friendliness to a fault. The reason they're called man's best friend is, of course, because dogs are very pure-hearted animals and will almost always love their owners unconditionally. This genetic rewiring created a new kind of social intelligence. When faced with a puzzle they can't solve, wolves will persist, trying to figure it out on their own. Dogs, on the other hand, do something remarkable. They quickly turn and look to a nearby human for guidance. They evolved to be exquisitely attuned to our social cues, our gaze, our gestures, with a skill that surpasses even that of chimpanzees, our closest genetic relatives. They effectively traded some of their ancestors' rugged independence for a revolutionary new strategy: cooperative problem solving with us. For thousands of years, this partnership continued to evolve, with humans unconsciously selecting dogs for utility, creating hardy animals adapted for herding, guarding, or hunting. But the second, and far more dramatic phase of their evolution began just a couple centuries ago. Spurred by an interest in pets during the 19th century, breeders began to methodically select for form over function, creating hundreds of the distinct breeds we see today. On a clear, sunny morning in March 1876, residents of rural Bath County, Kentucky witnessed one of the strangest downpours in history. It was a shower of meat falling from the sky. Around 11 on March 3rd, a farmer's wife named Mrs. Crouch was outdoors making soap when she suddenly saw chunks of raw flesh plummet to the ground around her. For a few minutes, pieces of bloody meat, some as light as snowflakes, others several inches across, rained over the Crouch farm, sticking to fences and grass in a broad area. Stunned and frightened, the Crouches suspected this uncanny deluge might be a divine omen or supernatural warning. By the time this bizarre Kentucky meat shower ended, it had strewn the ground with what looked like butcher's scraps across their farm. The farmers initially thought that the meat was beef, but they decided to take it over to a local butcher. The butcher in turn said that it definitely wasn't beef, and that while it looked like mutton, it didn't smell like it at all. A hunter, catching word of what had happened, asked to inspect the meat, and came to the conclusion that it was from a bear. Word of mouth about the meat shower was spreading rapidly, and it would soon hit the local news and then go national in the New York Times. From there, the meat shower captured the attention of legitimate scientists, and a number of samples were sent around the country for further analysis. Early explanations for the meat shower ranged from scientific curiosity to the bizarre. One initial hypothesis was that the material wasn't meat at all, but rather dried frog eggs or spawn that had been whisked into the air by winds and then fallen back down. This idea lost traction once microscopic examination revealed organized muscle fibers, which was clear evidence of animal tissue, not amorphous amphibian jelly. Another proposal suggested in a journal article that the meat was actually nostoc, a type of gelatinous algae-like bacteria that can swell into fleshy lumps after rain. However, this theory was quickly undermined by the facts of the case. The meat shower occurred under clear skies with no rain to trigger nostoc, and several scientists found that the samples undeniably had the cellular structure of animal flesh. In short, whatever fell on the Crouch farm was genuine meat, not a plant or pond slime masquerading as meat. As more samples arrived at laboratories, researchers began to characterize exactly what kind of meat had fallen and from where. Before long, investigators arrived at a plausible answer. The leading theory is that the meat had fallen from the stomachs of vultures flying overhead. Bath County was home to scavenging birds like turkey vultures, and these birds are notorious for vomiting their food as a defensive tactic or when they need to lighten their load. In fact, if one vulture in a flock regurgitates, it can trigger a chain reaction causing its companions to disgorge as well. In 1876, local experts pointed out that this buzzard blast scenario neatly fit the evidence. A flock of vultures might have been feasting on a dead animal, say a sheep, which would explain the mutton-like smell, and then something startled them. The startled birds then collectively regurgitated the half-digested meal mid-flight onto the Crouch farm. The gory payload would then scatter in the wind and fall to the ground as a rain of flesh and organs. Though no one actually saw the birds overhead at the time, the notion that a flock of nauseated vultures caused the incident was considered the most reasonable explanation. Other common explanations at the time focused on it being a supernatural event, or even if it wasn't supernatural, that it was an omen of things to come. And honestly, there's something extremely ominous about a sheep carcass raining down from the sky in bits regardless. I seriously wonder what an augur from Roman antiquity would have had to say about that sort of event. Notably, the meat from this event has been preserved, and as genetic testing improves on degraded specimens, we will one day know the origin of the meat. That, of course, doesn't prove the vulture theory, but it will provide some answer to exactly what animal rained down on the Crouch farm in the late 19th century.